You say you want to stop procrastinating, but the reason you can't isn't laziness, and it isn't a lack of willpower. The real cause is hiding so deep inside the architecture of your brain that you've probably never noticed it. It's a ghost in the machine, a loop that has been running since before your ancestors learned to shape flint. And the first person to put a name to this ghost was a Roman philosopher named Lucius Annaeus Seneca, who sat down in the year 65 after Christ and wrote a letter that would echo for 2,000 years. In that letter, Epistulae Morales, letter 1.1, Seneca spelled out the trap with eerie precision. He wrote, quote, "What you postpone today, you will have to bear tomorrow," unquote. He wasn't talking about schedules. He was talking about a kind of debt that compounds while you sleep. And if you've ever felt that invisible weight pressing on you while you scroll through a phone instead of doing the thing you know you should be doing, you already understand what he meant. But here's the strange part. The word itself, procrastination, didn't even exist in English until the early 1700s. It comes from the Latin procrastinare, which means to put off until tomorrow. The first recorded use in English is in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, written around the year 1620. Hobbes needed a word to describe a very specific failure of the human will, the moment when a rational mind chooses the easier path even though it knows the harder path is better. And he was standing on the shoulders of Aristotle, who had already described this phenomenon nearly 2,000 years earlier, in the year 384 before Christ. Aristotle called it akrasia, which translates to weakness of will. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 7, he observed that rational agents often, quote, delay what they know to be best, unquote. So this idea has been with us for over 2,300 years. It's older than the Roman Empire. It's older than the birth of most major religions. And yet, for all that time, we have been getting the cause completely backward. Think about this. The official story, the one you've been told your entire life, is that procrastination is a failure of discipline. That you simply need to manage your time better, set clearer goals, and stop being so lazy. That's the conventional explanation, and it's the one that your high school teachers gave you, and your parents, and every productivity guru on the internet. But here's what the data actually says. In 2007, a psychologist named Piers Steele published a meta-analysis in Psychological Bulletin that looked at 121 separate studies, encompassing over 1,000 participants. When he aggregated all that data, he found that the strongest predictor of procrastination wasn't laziness. It wasn't poor time management. The strongest predictor was impulsiveness, with a correlation coefficient of 0.44, and task aversiveness, how much you dislike the activity itself, with a correlation of 0.39. Combined, these two factors explained about 45% of the entire variance, which means nearly half of why you procrastinate has nothing to do with willpower. It has to do with how your brain processes the feeling of ugh when you look at a task that feels boring, stressful, or overwhelming. If you've ever been stuck in that loop, opening a browser tab, closing it, opening another, feeling the weight of something undone, you know that restless frustration. It's not that you don't know what to do. You do. But there's a wall in your mind that seems to harden every time you look at the task. And the data suggests that wall isn't weakness. It's a neurological signal. Let me show you the crack in the official story. In 2018, a team of researchers at the University of Colorado, led by a neuroscientist named J.M. Kelly, put 30 people inside an fMRI scanner and gave them a deadline-induced task. They wanted to see what happens in the brain when someone is procrastinating in real time. What they found was a split that changes everything. While the chronic procrastinators were performing the task, their brains showed significantly reduced activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive control, planning, and resisting temptation. The effect size was minus 0.42, which means the more someone procrastinated, the quieter this region became. At the same time, the ventral striatum, the reward center, the part of the brain that craves immediate pleasure, lit up with increased activation at a rate of plus 0.35. So while you're sitting there telling yourself, I should start working, your prefrontal cortex is literally disengaging, and your limbic system is screaming for the dopamine hit of something easier. It's not a moral failure. It's a tug of war between two ancient neural systems, and this is where the second crack appears. In 2021, another team led by Fushia Siroas, who has been studying procrastination for over a decade, published a study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology. General. They tracked 184 participants and found that the preference for immediate rewards, what psychologists call temporal discounting, mediated 45% of the relationship between impulsivity and procrastination. That indirect effect was statistically significant at p less than 0.001. What that means in plain language is that your brain is wired to devalue future rewards. A task that pays off in 3 weeks gives your brain almost no dopamine right now. But scrolling social media gives you a hit in 3 seconds. And because your ventral striatum is screaming louder than your prefrontal cortex, you choose the dopamine every single time. It's not that you lack motivation. It's that your brain is mathematically designed to prefer short-term pleasure over long-term payoff. And it's doing that calculation below the level of your conscious awareness. Now watch what happens when you layer on the stress. Siroise published another study in 2014 in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine, surveying 1,128 people. After controlling for age, gender, and socioeconomic status, they found that procrastination increased the odds of depressive symptoms by 63%, with an odds ratio of 1.63 and a 95% confidence interval from 1.41 to 1.88. And here's the part that hurts. In 2022, Siroa's team published a follow-up study in Health Psychology Review with 1,045 participants. They measured cortisol awakening response, the spike of stress hormone that happens in the first 30 minutes after you wake up. Chronic procrastinators showed a delta of plus 5.2 nanomoles per liter compared to non-procrastinators. Their bodies were starting the day already in a state of hyperarousal before they had even done anything wrong. The procrastination loop had become a physiological stressor, and that stress made it harder to start tasks, which caused more procrastination, which caused more stress. It's a feedback loop that tightens every time you go around. Here's what nobody talks about. The data also shows that this loop is not inevitable. It changes with age. In 2020, Van Eerde and Klingzig published a cross-national study in the European Journal of Personality that surveyed 2,500 people across multiple countries. They found that age negatively correlated with procrastination at minus 0.31. Students reported the highest mean scores, averaging 4.9 out of 7 on the procrastination scale. Working adults averaged 3.7 out of 7. So as people get older, they procrastinate less, not because they suddenly develop iron willpower, but because they learn, often through painful experience, that the cost of delaying is higher than the discomfort of starting. They've internalized Seneca's lesson, the one he wrote in 65 after Christ. The debt compounds. Every time you postpone, you are borrowing from your future self at an exorbitant interest rate, and your future self is the one who will pay with stress, with shame, with lost opportunity, with a higher cortisol awakening response tomorrow morning. If you've ever gone to bed at midnight knowing you had a deadline in the morning and felt that cold dread, you know exactly what I'm describing. The part most people miss is that the cycle isn't driven by a lack of knowledge. It's driven by a conflict between your identity and the task, in the world's most widely used psychometric tool for measuring this behavior. The procrastination scale, developed by Lay in 1986, which has accumulated over 30,000 citations on Google Scholar as of 2024. One of the key items reads, "I often find myself performing tasks that I had intended to do days before." Notice the phrasing. I find myself. It's almost as if the procrastinator is a passenger in their own body, watching themselves fail to act, unable to seize control. That feeling of helplessness is not a defect in your character. It's the signature of a brain that has been trained by thousands of repetitions to associate the task with negative emotion. And this is where the truth gets uncomfortable. The problem is not that you are lazy. The problem is that your procrastination is actually working. It is providing you with immediate emotional relief. The moment you stop thinking about the task and pick up your phone, your brain releases dopamine and you feel better. The relief is real, and it is powerful enough to override your rational planning. In that moment, your brain chooses the known comfort of distraction over the unknown discomfort of effort. And because the relief is immediate, your brain learns to repeat the behavior. Over time, it becomes a deeply grooved neural pathway, a highway rather than a dirt road. So the real question is not, how do I stop procrastinating? The real question is, why does my brain believe that starting is a threat? In the fMRI scan from 2018, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that goes quiet during procrastination is the same region that helps you regulate fear and override emotional impulses. When it shuts down, you are not just losing willpower. You are losing your ability to override the fight or flight response that the task has triggered. Your brain is treating a spreadsheet like a predator. That is the layer most people never see. The task itself, by association with past failure, past shame, past discomfort, has become a conditioned stimulus for anxiety. Your brain, in an attempt to protect you, fires the avoidance circuit, and that circuit is faster than your conscious thought. You have felt this. You have sat in front of a blinking cursor and felt your body tense. You have felt a wave of nausea, or a heaviness in your chest, or a sudden urge to stand up and walk away. That is not a lack of discipline. That is your amygdala sending a signal to your hypothalamus to activate the stress response. And your prefrontal cortex is being outgunned. Once you understand that procrastination is not weakness but a misdirected survival mechanism, the entire story flips. The goal is no longer to force yourself to work. The goal is to calm the threat response before the task can trigger it. The goal is to interrupt the loop at its entry point before the avoidance circuit has a chance to fire. And that requires understanding something even deeper. If what you are hearing is starting to click, if you are recognizing your own brain in these studies, stay with me, because this is where the loop starts to crack open. This is the part where you stop fighting yourself and start seeing the wiring. The mechanism was there all along. You didn't need to see it before, but now that you do, you cannot unsee it. And this is where the data reveals one last uncomfortable truth. In 2013, Fushia Siroise and Timothy Feichel published a study in Personality and Individual Differences that tracked 212 chronic procrastinators alongside a control group. The chronic procrastinators reported significantly higher perceived stress, averaging 5.8 on a 7-point scale, compared to 4.2 for the non-procrastinators. The effect size was large, at D equals 0.78. Their life satisfaction also dropped sharply, correlating at minus 0.51 with procrastination severity. What this means is that the loop doesn't just steal your time. It rewires your baseline mood. You start to live in a state of low-grade emergency, always bracing for the consequences of what you haven't done. And the cruelest part is that the relief you get from avoiding the task never lasts. It fades within minutes, replaced by guilt, which increases the amygdala's sensitivity, which makes the next task feel even more threatening. The loop tightens, but understanding the loop is the first step out of it. Here is the concrete reality. Every time you sit down to work and feel that wall rise up, that is not a sign that you are broken. That is a sign that your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It is protecting you from a perceived threat. The task is not the threat. The feeling associated with the task is the threat. And your brain cannot tell the difference. The fMRI scan from 2018 proved it. The cortisol data from 2022 proved it. The temporal discounting study from 2021 proved it. The evidence is not ambiguous. You are not weak. You are neurologically normal, operating exactly as your wiring dictates. But here is what changes everything. Once you recognize the loop, you can stop feeding it. You can notice the moment when your hand reaches for the phone, and instead of judging yourself, you can observe the impulse as an artifact of an ancient system. You can take 3 slow breaths to lower the cortisol spike before you touch the task. You can break the task into a fragment so small that it does not trigger the threat response. Writing 1 sentence, opening 1 file, sending 1 email. And in that single microscopic act of starting, you teach your brain that the threat was false. You prove to your amygdala that the spreadsheet is not a predator, and the loop loses its grip. One tiny start at a time. If this has landed somewhere in you, write this in the comments. The one task you are avoiding right now. Not because you need to confess, but because putting words to it breaks the silence, and breaking the silence breaks the loop. The evidence is clear. The wiring is visible, and the decision about what to do next is yours alone. Between task and relief, between your rational goal and your emotional escape, and the driver of that escape, the engine that keeps the loop spinning, is one thing: the feeling that you cannot tolerate the task. Here is the moment that changes the lens. Every study, every fMRI scan, every cortisol measurement points to the same conclusion. The procrastination loop is not a character flaw. It is a conditioned emotional response that has been reinforced thousands of times in thousands of small moments until it became automatic. The task itself is neutral. The meaning you attach to it, the shame, the boredom, the overwhelm, the fear, that is what triggers the avoidance circuit. And that meaning was learned, which means it can be unlearned. Think about this. The procrastination scale, developed by Lay in 1986, asks respondents to rate statements like, "I delay making decisions until it is too late." The scale does not measure how lazy you are. It measures how often your avoidance circuit fires in response to a trigger. And the trigger is almost always the same. A task that you have attached a negative emotional prediction to. You predict it will be boring. You predict it will be hard. You predict you will fail. And your brain believes the prediction more than it believes your conscious plan. But here is the crack in the system. The prediction is almost always wrong. The task is almost never as bad as your brain anticipates. And once you start, the feeling usually shifts. The wall dissolves, the dread lifts, and you are left wondering why you waited so long. That gap between the predicted suffering and the actual experience is where the transformation lives. If you have ever started something you had been dreading for weeks and realized within 5 minutes that it was fine, you know exactly what I am describing. The relief is real. The relief is powerful, and it is the only antidote to the loop. Here is what the data does not tell you, but what the silent space between the studies implies. Every time you delay, you are not just losing time. You are feeding a neural circuit that grows stronger with each repetition. And every time you start, Even for 30 seconds, you are starving that same circuit. You are teaching your brain that the threat was a ghost. The evidence from the fMRI scan in 2018 shows that the prefrontal cortex does not need to be strong at the start. It needs to be activated. And activation happens through action, not through waiting for motivation. Motivation follows action, not the other way around. You have been waiting to feel ready, but the readiness never arrives inside the waiting. It arrives inside the doing, and the doing can be absurdly small. One sentence, one push-up, one email. The size of the start does not matter. What matters is that you break the loop's power supply, which is the belief that you cannot start. This has been the hidden truth from the beginning. Seneca knew it in 65 after Christ. Aristotle described it in 384 before Christ. Hobbes named it in 1620. And the modern data, with all its precision and its 1,000 participants and its statistically significant p-values, has only confirmed what the philosophers already understood. Procrastination is not a problem of time. It is a problem of emotional regulation. And the moment you stop treating it as a moral failure and start treating it as a biological signal, you take the first step out of the loop. The final piece is this: the loop will not vanish because you understand it. Understanding is not enough, but understanding is the crack. And through that crack, you can choose a different response the next time the wall rises. You can say to yourself, quietly, without judgment, "That is the loop. I see it. And I'm going to write one sentence anyway." Not to prove anything, not to become productive, but to starve the circuit, one tiny start at a time. The question is not whether you can change. The question is whether you will recognize the loop the next time it closes around you, and whether in that moment you will choose to open a single crack of light.